He walked into the bank with calm eyes and steady hands, dressed modestly, shoes worn but clean. Yet within seconds, a security guard blocked his path and asked if he was lost, maybe looking for the soup kitchen down the street. The receptionist glanced at his skin, then his clothes, then chuckled and told him private banking was for members, not visitors. No one asked his name. No one looked at his documents. They didn't need to, because in their eyes, his presence alone was a mistake to be corrected. They spoke over him, laughed behind him, and when he stayed silent, they escalated. A manager hinted his hair was unprofessional. A guard said he was loitering. A customer nodded and muttered, "Good, keep places like this safe." And just like that, they pushed him out, shamed, ignored, erased, without ever knowing the ground they had just stepped on. What happens next will not only change their lives, but shake the walls of the system they trusted. You won't believe who he really is or what power he holds. If you believe stories like this need to be told, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment about where you're watching from, and tell us, what would you have done if you were standing in his shoes? The doors to the Loxley First National Bank opened with a hush, the kind of expensive silence only polished glass and climate control could buy. Avon Rourke stepped in quietly, unnoticed at first, his stride even, expression unreadable, dressed in a charcoal jacket and a clean, buttoned shirt. The soles of his shoes, though scuffed from time, carried no hesitation. He had crossed harder thresholds than this one. But barely 3 paces in, the mood shifted. Carlton, the building's security guard, a wide-set man with creases of judgment etched deep into his cheeks, glanced up from his tablet and caught sight of Avon. He didn't move at first, just stared, the way people sometimes do when they can't quite reconcile what they're seeing with what they expect. Then Carlton straightened, stepped forward, and raised one thick arm across the entry lane. It wasn't a gesture of welcome. His face didn't show confusion or concern, just calculation. He gave Avon the kind of look usually reserved for panhandlers or street preachers, then said, with a flat tone and a slow scan from head to foot, that this wasn't a food drive. Asked if Avon had maybe wandered too far down the street looking for the community center. It was less a question and more an accusation wrapped in mockery. Avon didn't blink, didn't speak. Just reached into his inside pocket and pulled out the appointment card, crisp and cream-colored, embossed with the bank's logo in silver. He held it steady, offered it wordlessly. Carlton glanced at it but didn't touch it, as though it might be counterfeit by contact alone. Then he made a small grunt of acknowledgement, the kind that still held doubt, and jerked his chin toward the reception desk like Avon was being granted a favor. Avon stepped past him, slowly, without apology. The lobby was cool and cavernous, echoing with the soft murmur of wealth. People in suits spoke in murmurs, sipping espresso in white porcelain. The air smelled like eucalyptus and polish. At the front counter stood Blaine, the morning receptionist, a man of neatly styled blonde hair and the kind of posture that came with a practiced air of entitlement. He didn't smile when Avon approached, just looked at the man's shoes, canvas, aged, worn but clean, then up at the jacket that didn't have a visible label, and back at Avon's face with the thin sort of smile that often accompanied sarcasm. Blaine's voice had a lilt to it when he asked, flatly, what the purpose of Avon's visit was. He didn't ask for a name, didn't offer a greeting. And when Avon calmly gave his name and appointment time, Blaine's brows lifted like he'd misheard. Then, after a long pause and a glance to the side, Blaine said that private wealth services were by invitation, that they didn't really handle debit card disputes at this desk. Avon didn't speak. He just raised the card again, placed it down. Blaine's eyes dropped, scanned the paper like it might reveal its origin through some flaw. He tapped his keyboard twice, said nothing for nearly 30 seconds, and finally muttered that he would check the calendar. A few feet away, another client stepped in, a middle-aged white man in a designer trench coat and Rolex, who was greeted by name, ushered past velvet rope, offered cappuccino. Blaine didn't look up again at Avon for over 5 minutes. The minutes passed like a test. Avon stood with hands loosely folded, eyes lowered but alert, posture still. Every second was an unspoken challenge. He was used to this dance, the slow, deliberate erosion of dignity behind every supposed procedure. Carlton reappeared briefly and stood to the side, arms folded, watching with disinterest. When Blaine finally looked up, he cleared his throat and said that he couldn't find the name on file. Then asked again, more pointedly this time, if Avon was absolutely certain he was in the right building. There was a hint of smirk now, playing at the corners of Blaine's lips, like he was enjoying the discomfort he tried so hard to manufacture. Avon responded only with silence, then leaned down and tapped the name printed on the appointment card still resting on the desk. Blaine glanced down again, then typed faster this time. His expression didn't shift, but his posture did, slightly, as if realizing this delay was approaching the line of inexcusable. Still, he didn't apologize. He didn't offer a drink or a seat. He didn't ask if Avon was cold from standing under the air vent. Instead, he said with faux sympathy that sometimes clients who look up appointments online confuse this branch with their downtown location. Suggested Avon might want to try there. Avon didn't move. He simply said the name of the banker who had signed the invitation letter. They simply evolved. Eyes darted his way only to slide off quickly, like observers trying to avoid being caught staring at something unpleasant. A mother walking past him subtly pulled her purse tighter under her arm. A sharply dressed banker murmured something into his phone and laughed as he passed, the sound brittle and deliberate. 10 minutes turned into 20, then 25. Avon said nothing, moved not at all. His silence wasn't surrender, it was measured. But inside, a steady flame flickered. A door to the side of the reception finally clicked open, and a woman in a crimson blouse and a silver pendant called out a name. It wasn't his. Then another name. Finally, Blaine gestured without words, then called out, mispronouncing Rourke, with a crooked smirk. Avon stood, walked past Carlton again, who didn't bother to move this time, just gave a tight grunt and muttered something under his breath. Avon ignored it. He was led down a hallway where the plush carpet dampened sound, where even the air seemed richer. At the end of it, he was shown into a glass-walled office where Darla, mid-30s, blonde bob, and a perfume that clung aggressively to her presence, sat behind a desk too large for her stature. She barely looked up from her screen as Avon entered. Only when he stood silently for several seconds did she finally glance up. Her expression shifted instantly, not to one of welcome, but mild confusion, then disbelief, then poorly concealed disdain. She gestured toward the chair in front of her desk and began typing, not waiting for Avon to sit before asking, in a tone bordering on amusement, what business brought him to the private wealth division. Avon reached into his blazer, drew out the folder, thin, meticulous, and slid it across the table. It was a proposal comprehensive, elegant in design, outlining a mid-sized capital acquisition and estate consolidation. Darla looked at the front page, her smile widening into something closer to a smirk. We usually review these through our institutional portal, she said, flipping the pages as though searching for a typo, a flaw, anything to disqualify. Her eyes skimmed, not truly reading. It's rare, she continued, to receive walk-ins with this kind of material. Most are introduced through advisors, or referrals, or, she trailed off, looking pointedly at Avon's worn shoes again, as if completing the sentence in her mind. He didn't flinch. She asked where he worked, what assets he controlled, and if he had documentation to back up these figures. When he answered plainly, her fingers paused on the keyboard. She looked at him then, not startled, but annoyed that she couldn't immediately dismiss him. The meeting didn't get better. Her questions were not framed in curiosity, but coated in skepticism. Each inquiry seemed designed less to learn and more to challenge. She even asked, halfway through, if he was sure he had meant to come to this branch, as there was a community-focused financial literacy program held weekly at their partner location across town. Some of our clients start there, she offered, voice syrupy. It's a good foundation before stepping into these kinds of conversations. Avon blinked once, said nothing, just slid the second document from the folder. Asset verification notarized. Darla froze for a beat, then forced a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. It was then, as tension thickened, that a cough sounded from the hallway. A slow, deliberate one. An older man, white hair perfectly parted, stepped halfway into the office. His blue cashmere scarf matched his tie. He glanced at Darla, then at Avon. "That's new," he muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Didn't know we were opening seats for actors from those protest dramas." His words carried no humor, only the drawl of casual cruelty. Avon turned slightly in his chair, catching the man's eyes. The man raised his brows, unapologetic. "Just saying. Can't tell if he's here to invest or film a commercial." Darla's lips twitched. She didn't reprimand him. She didn't even look surprised. She merely cleared her throat and continued flipping the pages of Avon's folder, as if nothing had happened. The man walked away slowly, clearly not worried about being reported. His voice echoed faintly down the corridor. Used to be a time people knew where they belonged. Avon sat motionless. His breath was even, his spine upright. His fingers rested on the armrest, not curled, not clenched. Darla finished a review, closed the folder, and said she would pass it along to compliance, though her tone suggested it would likely be left to gather dust in a tray somewhere. She didn't offer to set up a follow-up meeting, didn't ask if Avon had questions. She stood abruptly, extending her hand like someone forced to shake with a protester. Avon rose, accepted the handshake, and without another word, turned and walked out of the office. The hallway now seemed colder. The corridor buzzed with a low murmur of laughter from somewhere behind him. He passed the reception desk again, where Blaine now chatted with another employee. Both looked up. One of them, maybe intentionally, maybe not, mimicked the click of camera shutters with his mouth as Avon passed, as if capturing the moment for memory. Avon's pace never changed. His shoulders never sagged. But something in his eyes had hardened, just slightly. He walked back through the main lobby, where Carlton was now laughing at something on his phone. He had handed over documents that should have commanded respect, but instead received dismissals wrapped in fake politeness. Now, with nothing more to prove but everything to remember, he made his way toward the exit. But dignity, in places like these, was not a thing easily granted, and never quietly accepted. Blaine spotted him approaching and leaned toward Carlton with a muttered word, followed by a low, humorless chuckle. Avon didn't need to hear it. He could read it in their posture, in the amused glances exchanged behind the polished desk. He didn't stop, didn't hesitate, until Carlton suddenly stepped directly in his path. "Sir, you'll need to stay right here," the guard said, loud enough for heads to turn. "Bank policy." Avon frowned, not in anger, but in confusion. "My meeting's concluded," he replied plainly. "I'm heading out." Carlton shook his head, his stance widening, hand resting lightly near the radio clipped to his belt. "We've had reports of a disturbance. You've been acting aggressive. Clients are feeling unsafe." The words hung in the air like smoke, visible, stinging, suffocating. At first, there was silence, just a few uncertain murmurs from the rows of chairs behind Avon. Then Blaine raised his voice with mock concern. He was getting loud near the private offices, he announced. We had to ask him to calm down twice. A woman nearby gasped audibly. "He was shouting?" she asked, clearly pleased to have found something to gossip about. Another man leaned forward, whispering something about that kind of energy not belonging in financial institutions. Avon didn't move. He kept his arms loosely at his sides. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. Instead, he said, "That's not true." Carlton smirked, already raising his radio. "We can let the officers sort it out," he replied. "Please wait right here." A few moments later, two uniformed police officers entered the bank through the side entrance. One was tall, barrel-chested, with mirrored sunglasses still on despite being indoors. The other, younger and thinner, followed with a cautious gait. Carlton waved them over quickly, explaining the situation in tones low enough to obscure the lies, but loud enough for nearby customers to hear key words: disturbance, aggressive, non-compliant. The taller officer turned to Avon and asked for identification. Avon provided it without hesitation. The officer barely glanced at it before stepping slightly closer. "We received a call about disorderly conduct," he said. "A few customers expressed concern." We'll have to ask you to step outside while we sort this out." "I haven't done anything wrong," Avon replied, his voice still steady. "I came for a scheduled meeting. I presented identification. I followed instructions." "That may be," the officer said, placing a hand gently on Avon's elbow. "But right now, this is about de-escalation." The word echoed louder than intended. De-escalation. A word used not for action, but for perception. Around them, the crowd was shifting. Heads turned. Phones lowered. Someone mumbled something about how he was probably just looking for a payout. Another voice said, "Always playing the victim, aren't they?" The younger officer, perhaps sensing the imbalance, said nothing at all. Just stood still, watching the scene unfold as if from behind glass. Avon inhaled slowly, nodded once, and stepped aside, following the officers as they led him gently, but not quietly, through the lobby toward the exit. No handcuffs, no shouting, just enough movement to draw attention, enough to solidify an image in the minds of every watching eye. That image would stick harder than facts ever could. A tall, black man in a fitted blazer, escorted from a bank by police. Never mind a reason. Never mind the truth. Outside, the air was cooler than before. Avon stood on the sidewalk, the door closing behind him with a hiss too final to ignore. The taller officer remained near the entrance, hand still on his belt. The younger one stood beside Avon, uncertain. "What happens now?" Avon asked. "They said they'd call," the younger one muttered. "Probably nothing. We'll wait a few minutes, then you're free to go." "I'm already free," Avon said. "You're just here to remind me that freedom can be interrupted." The officer didn't respond. Silence filled the space between them, awkward and honest. Behind the glass doors, Avon could see Blaine laughing, handing something to Carlton. He watched Darla walk across the mezzanine with a folder under her arm, no doubt onto her next meeting. Carlton was no longer at the front, replaced by a younger guard who barely looked up. The lobby buzzed with new energy, clients arriving for mid-morning appointments, executives slipping in through side entrances, assistants whispering into phones. The machine kept turning. Avon stepped up to the counter again, now manned by a different receptionist, younger than Blaine, more neutral in expression, but visibly confused as she asked if he had been helped earlier. "I was," Avon said, "but clearly not enough." She scanned his name into the system, squinted at the screen, then motioned for someone behind the counter. A moment later, a middle-aged woman emerged from a side corridor, sharp-featured and tightly styled, her tailored suit ironed to perfection, her expression already set in annoyance before she reached the desk. This was Lorraine Ashcroft, the branch manager. She had the air of someone who never asked questions, only issued decisions. Her gaze swept over Avon with the precision of a scanner searching for faults. First his shoes, then the jacket, then the tight coils of his natural hair, slightly frizzed from the humidity. Her lip curled so slightly it could have passed unnoticed. She asked Avon to step aside for a quick conversation in the back office, her tone implying formality, but her eyes brimming with suspicion. He followed. The office was smaller than Darla's, but colder in atmosphere. Lorraine didn't offer a seat. She stood behind her desk, arms crossed, a thin tablet in one hand. "Mr. Rourke," she began, her voice flat. "You were removed earlier for causing a disruption. Re-entering the premises without clearance isn't typically permitted." Avon didn't blink. "I was never told I couldn't return. I came for a scheduled financial review. I have documentation. I brought it earlier." Lorraine flipped the tablet screen toward herself, swiped twice, and frowned. "Even if that's the case," she said, "this branch maintains a specific code of conduct for its clientele. Professional appearance is part of that expectation. We're not a street corner credit union." Her words were ice, but her meaning was flame. She didn't reference his clothes directly. She didn't say the word hair. She didn't need to. Her eyes had already spoken. "We provide service," she continued, "to individuals who represent the values and image of this institution." Avon remained still, his voice low and steady. "So you're saying I don't?" Lorraine hesitated, then smiled, a sharp, humorless smile. I'm saying your presentation doesn't align with the clientele this branch is built to serve." It wasn't just a comment. It was the calm with which she delivered it, the bureaucratic detachment, the refusal to acknowledge insult because she had encoded it so carefully in policy. Avon placed the folder down again. "This," he said, tapping the cover, "is backed by verified holdings. If my appearance is a problem, perhaps your values are the real issue." Lorraine stared at the folder without touching it. "Your assets don't exempt you from expectations. We don't tailor our image to fit every variation of individuality." The pause before the last word was almost imperceptible. "Almost. We're not refusing to serve you," she added, "but we do reserve the right to redirect you to more appropriate service channels." She tapped the screen again and handed him a slip of paper. It listed a branch on the other side of town, smaller, less resourced, and far from a financial district. "They may be better equipped to assist," she said. "No offense." Avon didn't move. His eyes lingered on the slip for a moment, then returned to hers. "I know what this is," he said. "This isn't about equipment. It's about comfort. Yours." Lorraine didn't respond. She merely gestured toward the hallway. "Someone will escort you out." Avon picked up the folder again, turned, and stepped back into the corridor. He didn't wait for the escort. He walked on his own. But the humiliation hadn't yet finished with him. Back in the main lobby, a junior staffer pushing a cart of refreshments weaved carefully between seating areas. She was young, wide-eyed, clearly new. When she reached Avon's section of the lounge, she paused, holding out a sleek white cup with the bank's logo embossed in gold. "Your latte," she said brightly. Avon reached out instinctively, surprised by the unexpected courtesy. But just as his fingers touched the cardboard sleeve, the girl blinked, hesitated, and pulled it back. "Oh," she said, cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry. I thought you were someone else. I didn't realize." Her eyes darted to his folder, then to his face, then down to the polished floor. "They said to take it to the client near the windows." Without another word, she wheeled the cart away. Avon sat back down. Behind him, a couple in matching gray suits entered, handed over their cards, and were immediately offered tea and ushered through the velvet-parted doorway marked private consultations. Avon watched without expression, not blinking, not moving, as person after person arrived and vanished into the inner sanctum, while he sat untouched, unacknowledged, unseen. His name had not been called. No one came to update him. No glance from the staff lingered long enough to be considered engagement. He could have been a statue, a shadow, a misplaced chair. Yet he knew the system was tracking every entry. Knew they had his records. He had submitted documents, had confirmed appointments, had done everything expected of someone seeking to be seen as legitimate. Still, legitimacy in this place was not about procedure. It was about perception. After nearly 35 minutes of waiting, his third time glancing at the slow tick of the glass-encased wall clock, Avon finally rose. Not in anger, not abruptly, but with the calm deliberation of someone who had weighed every possibility and now chose to demand something close to fairness. He stepped toward the reception counter, folder in hand, and waited behind a man who was currently being congratulated on securing a 7-figure loan. When the man left, the receptionist barely looked up. "Yes?" she asked, tone thin. "I've been waiting for a scheduled meeting," Avon said. "I confirmed it earlier. I provided documentation." The receptionist typed something into her terminal, fingers moving slowly. She squinted at the screen, then paused, her lips pressing together before she looked back up. "I'm not seeing your name on the active queue," she said. "Are you sure it was today?" Avon didn't answer that. He simply retrieved a printout from the folder, an email confirmation, time-stamped, bearing both the bank's logo and the assigned wealth manager's signature. He handed it over. The receptionist took it, glanced at it briefly, then turned and disappeared through a side door without explanation. Avon waited, standing where he was, as the sounds of the lobby continued around him. When the door finally opened again, Lorraine reappeared, her posture stiffer than earlier, her expression more forced. She did not apologize. She did not greet him. Instead, she looked at the email in her hand, then handed it back to him with a faint shake of the head. "Unfortunately, I'm not seeing your name reflected on the active session log," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "It's possible there was a scheduling error or a miscommunication between departments. These things happen sometimes." Avon responded only with a slow blink. "So the confirmation, the documents, the previous appointment, all of that is irrelevant now." Lorraine's mouth tightened. "I didn't say that," she replied. "But without system verification, we can't proceed with privileged consultations. It's a matter of compliance." The word landed like a verdict. Around them, the room continued to welcome new clients, all of whom were escorted past velvet ropes, while Avon remained standing, folder in hand, treated like a scheduling error instead of a person. "You're welcome," Lorraine added, "to reach out to client services for rescheduling." She didn't offer to assist. She didn't offer a name or extension. Just stepped aside as another client arrived. One greeted warmly and guided toward the secure rooms Avon had never been allowed to enter. "Have a good day," she said flatly, before turning and disappearing once more. Avon stood there for a full minute after she left, motionless. Then slowly, he walked back to the chair he had occupied earlier, lowered himself into it, and set the folder down. His eyes scanned the room again, not searching for help, not seeking acknowledgement, just watching, observing how easily civility could mask exclusion, how quickly people could perform politeness while quietly erasing someone's presence. The same junior employee who had withdrawn the coffee earlier passed again, eyes flicking toward him and away with visible discomfort. Another banker walked across the room, stopped briefly to look at Avon's open folder, and then moved on without a word. It was in the small movements, the glance that didn't linger, the silence that filled the space where service should have lived, that the bank revealed its truth. Across the room, Blaine returned from the elevators, his laughter trailing behind him like smoke from a slow burn. He noticed Avon still seated, and the shift in his smile was immediate. It became sharper, deliberate, laced with the cruel confidence of someone who believed they were too protected to be called out. Without approaching, he gestured toward the desk. Moments later, two junior associates leaned in toward Lorraine's office door, whispered something, and one of them stepped away while the other remained to watch Avon from a distance, arms crossed, as though preparing for confrontation. The energy had changed. Avon felt it tighten around him, not explosive, but coordinated. He recognized the tactic, escalation by design, forcing a reaction to justify removal. When Carlton re-entered the lobby, returning from his break with a cup of coffee in hand and sunglasses still perched on his head despite the dim interior lighting, the message was clear. He didn't walk toward his usual post. He walked directly toward Avon. Without ceremony, without even waiting for a complaint, Carlton positioned himself at Avon's side and spoke in a voice not loud enough to draw alarm, but loud enough to ensure those nearby could hear. "Sir, it's time for you to leave the premises. You've been advised that no appointment exists, and we cannot allow you to loiter in client-only spaces." Avon looked up with the stillness of someone who understood exactly what was happening. He didn't stand. He didn't resist. He only said, "I'm not loitering. I'm waiting for service that was promised and confirmed." Carlton didn't respond directly. Instead, he raised his voice a fraction, enough for it to carry. "You've been asked to leave." This time, more heads turned. A man across the room set down his espresso. A woman flipped her magazine closed. Lorraine emerged from her office, but said nothing. She stood near the front desk with her arms folded, watching like a warden inspecting a cell block. Avon stood slowly, smoothing his blazer, lifting the folder from the seat beside him. Carlton didn't move aside. Instead, he turned slightly so that his shoulder nudged Avon's path, forcing the man to step around him. The gesture was subtle, but it dripped with intent. As Avon walked through the lounge, all movement paused. Not because of alarm, but because of curiosity. Like spectators observing a disturbance on a security monitor. Blaine murmured something to a colleague who stifled a laugh. A receptionist at the far end pressed her fingers to her mouth to mask a smirk. Then, as Avon approached the double glass doors leading back into the main lobby, an older man sitting near the corner stood suddenly, his cane tapping sharply against the marble. He looked at Avon with the cold certainty of someone who had never been challenged in his assumptions and had no interest in starting now. "It's good they're doing something about it," he said loudly. "We have to keep places like this safe." The words cut through the air with precision. No one objected. No one corrected him. In fact, two other clients, one wearing a deep blue suit and the other sipping from a porcelain cup, nodded. One even muttered in agreement. "It's about standards," he said. "Otherwise, what's the point of private banking?" Avon didn't stop. He kept walking, his steps unhurried, his posture controlled, but the heat at the back of his neck pulsed like a second heartbeat. Carlton followed closely behind, just near enough to apply pressure without making contact. As Avon passed through the final set of doors, a gust of warmer air from the streets spilled in, mixing with the artificially chilled air of the lobby. The security cameras mounted above the entrance flickered as they tracked motion. Avon paused at the threshold for a brief second, glanced over his shoulder not at Carlton or Lorraine or Blaine, but at the institution itself, the walls, the structure, the carefully curated facade that pretended to offer opportunity while quietly enforcing exclusion. Behind him, a woman reached for her phone, not to film, not for justice, but with the casual hunger of someone who wanted to capture a story. Her camera rose, lens pointed casually in his direction, like snapping an image of a passing celebrity who had stumbled out of favor. A man beside her leaned in to whisper something. She giggled, not bothering to lower the phone. "That's what happens when you don't know your place," she said under her breath, not quietly enough. Avon exited the building. Carlton remained by the door for a moment, ensuring no return, then turned back inside. As the doors slid shut behind Avon, he took one step down the smooth granite stairs, then stopped. The sun had risen higher now, burning brighter, casting stark shadows that stretched down the sidewalk like silent witnesses. The city hummed with movement, buses growling, horns barking, heels clicking against concrete. But in Avon's chest, all noise fell away. The silence wasn't peace. It was clarity. And clarity, when fully formed, became choice. He looked down at the folder still in his hands. It wasn't creased, wasn't damaged. It contained the same documents, the same value, the same power. But now it also contained memory. Every word, every silence, every glance, every act of false civility, every echo of laughter, every nod of agreement to cruelty spoken aloud. The entire building had stood against him not with force, but with dismissal. It was awareness sharpened to the edge of precision. His phone vibrated softly in his jacket pocket. He slowed his pace just enough to answer it, recognizing the name on the screen instantly. The voice on the other end didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're ready," it said. "Just say the word. Are we pulling or holding?" Avon glanced back once at the facade of the bank, its mirrored surface still gleaming with pretense. His voice was calm, measured, but absolute. "We're pulling. Full." The voice paused. "Understood." "And the public declaration?" Avon's eyes narrowed slightly. "Hold that until I speak to them directly." He ended the call without another word, turned on his heel, and began walking back across the plaza toward the building that had just discarded him. This time, his steps didn't whisper, they declared. He approached the door again, passed the younger guard without a glance, and stepped into the chilled air of the lobby with the same authority that the marble floor tried to repel. Everything in the room seemed to shift. Carlton looked up from the front desk and stood, surprised, trying to mask it with a practiced frown. Blaine, mid-conversation, turned as well, his expression flickering from amusement to confusion to something much closer to fear as he noticed the card now displayed in Avon's hand. It was black metallic and bore the engraved crest of the Barrow and Creed Holdings Corporation, one of the largest private equity consortiums in the country, and the majority shareholder of Loxley First National Bank. Avon didn't wave it. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked toward the reception desk, extended the card toward the receptionist, and said, "Get me your regional managing director." Now, The receptionist stammered, her fingers fumbling across the keyboard. Carlton stepped forward quickly, unsure whether to intervene or obey. Blaine started to speak, but stopped himself, reading the emblem on the card, understanding its implications, understanding perhaps for the first time in his career that he had made a mistake too costly to bury. Avon waited. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence was no longer to be questioned. Within 5 minutes, the elevator opened with a chime that rang like a courtroom bell, and 2 executives emerged, both in press suits, both visibly tense. They introduced themselves with quiet urgency, asked Avon to join them in a private conference room, but Avon declined to move. "I'll speak here," he said, "in view of the people who judged me unworthy of the seat I owned." Behind him, the room had grown still. Lorraine had emerged once again, but now her expression was not composed. It was fractured, uncertain. Avon turned toward her and spoke not as a man seeking redress, but as one delivering verdict. "You denied me service," he said. "You attempted to redirect me based on appearance, not records. Your team fabricated a disruption. Security escorted me out with no justification. I will now report this as breach of fiduciary conduct under Title VII protocol. Additionally, I am initiating withdrawal of all assets under my control from your branch and recommending our board review your division's continued operation." Lorraine stepped forward, her mouth slightly open. "Mr. Rourke," she began, her voice cracking. "We didn't know." Avon cut her off. "You didn't ask. You assumed, and assumptions carry cost." His words landed harder than shouting ever could. Blaine lowered his eyes. Carlton's stance faltered. The room that had once expelled him now watched silently as the man they had dismissed unveiled not vengeance, but consequence. Avon handed the executives a sealed envelope. "Inside is formal notice," he said, "effective immediately." One of them tried to speak, offered a seat, suggested privacy, but Avon raised a hand. "This happened in public. It will be addressed in public." As the car pulled away, Avon retrieved a slim black case from the seat beside him, unlocked it with a fingerprint scan, and removed a secure tablet from inside. With 3 precise taps and 1 biometric confirmation, he accessed the internal communications network of Barrow and Creed Holdings. A message flashed across the screen. "Transaction gateway open. Awaiting executive authorization." Avon typed a single command. "Suspend regional capital flow for Loxley First National, Memphis Central Branch. Effective immediately. Reassign oversight to compliance security for fiduciary breach review. Priority red." Then, without pause, he opened the secondary channel reserved for governance action. This one required double verification. He passed both. Then he issued it. Transfer temporary voting power from regional delegates to executive chair. Override in effect for 72 hours. Justification: ethics violation. With that, Avon became not just an officer of the parent corporation, but the controlling force behind every operational lever of the bank that had sought to humiliate him. As the vehicle turned south, Avon's phone rang again. It was a board contact. "Sir," the voice said, breathless, "we're receiving internal alerts from the Memphis division. They're reporting blocked transactions and a sudden halt in fund access." "Did you?" Avon interrupted. "They earned it. We're not closing a branch. We're cleansing one." He paused, then added, "Initiate forensic review. All outbound transfers. All privileged accounts. I want a list of every signature that approved discretionary handling in the last 90 days. No exceptions." By the time the car pulled into the underground garage of the Regional Operations Center, word had already begun spreading across multiple departments. Within 15 minutes, Internal Risk Control had received Level 3 suspension orders, and at least 6 corporate officers from the Loxley First National hierarchy were scrambling to understand what had triggered the override. Avon exited the car, walked through the stark white corridor of the executive wing, passed under motion sensors and ID scanners, and entered the war room of the financial institution's top floor, an open space of glass and steel where crises were addressed before they became headlines. A map of the country glowed across the curved wall. 1. Memphis, pulsed yellow. Soon it would flash red. He took his seat at the center console. With a single nod, two analysts began decrypting real-time transaction flow. The screen filled with lines of code and figures, halted wires, frozen authorizations, auto-flagged withdrawals. On another screen, a list of names began to appear, employees, managers, and department heads connected to the flag branch. Lorraine Ashcroft, Blaine Foster, Carlton Price. Even Darla's name was there, linked to multiple incomplete forms with questionable override signatures. Avon read them all. One of the compliance officers leaned toward him and asked, "Would you like to authorize Executive Review Board summons?" Avon nodded. "Yes, but only after we finish." "Finish what, sir?" "Establishing how far the rock goes." As teams moved through data clusters, financial review protocols, and employee records, the results came fast. Evidence of skewed service practices, internal messages referencing appearance-based filters, and personal notations on client files that included descriptors like watch list and unfamiliar tone. All of it had been saved. All of it recoverable. Avon leaned back. Then, at last, he opened the direct channel to the bank's CEO. The man answered quickly, his voice tight. "Avon," he began, "I've been briefed. This was unacceptable." "If you're requesting immediate terminations," Avon interrupted. "I'm not requesting. I've executed. The branch is frozen. Every account, every asset. No client connected to that location can move a cent until we complete the sweep. That includes the regional manager and all discretionary clients whose relationships were leveraged to justify bias." The CEO hesitated. "We may face backlash." "You understand the press. Let them speak," Avon said. "Let them try to defend this. But if we don't act, we don't survive. I'm not jeopardizing a $42 billion network to protect a few arrogant gatekeepers." Silence followed. Then understood. "Do you want to lead the press response?" "No. I want them to see action before apology. That's the difference between saving face and setting precedent." Then Avon ended the call. The next hour moved quickly. Emergency internal bulletins were issued. An executive summit was scheduled. High-value clients linked to the Memphis branch received formal notifications that service was suspended pending ethical review. Multiple attempts by Lorraine to contact corporate went unanswered. Her access credentials already revoked. Blaine's emails bounced back with a lockout notice. But when she lifted her badge and pressed it to the reader, nothing happened. No beep, no green light, only a cold red glow and a quiet tone that meant rejection. She tried again, then again, her motions becoming more abrupt, more flustered, before she finally turned to the suited figure standing by the door. "There must be a mistake," she said, gesturing to the badge. The man didn't smile. "Your access has been suspended, Ms. Ashcroft. You're being placed under review pending the outcome of an internal investigation. We've been instructed to ask you to step aside." "Investigation?" she asked, her voice rising. "What investigation? I'm the branch manager." The man didn't react. He simply repeated the instruction. Lorraine stood frozen for several seconds, her mind racing. She reached for her phone, dialed a direct number, but instead of the expected line to regional operations, a recorded voice replied, "Your account is under compliance review. Please direct further inquiries to corporate legal." Nearby, Blaine Foster arrived wearing his usual smirk, holding a coffee and humming a tune as if the previous day's events were a distant inconvenience. That smile died instantly when he too was denied entry. Carlton was the last to arrive, still in uniform, still assuming the authority he had enjoyed the day before. He didn't speak when his badge failed. He only muttered a curse and kicked the doorframe lightly before turning away. Inside the building, teams from Barrow and Creed's internal compliance division were already working. Files had been pulled, computers disconnected, workstations sealed. The offices of Lorraine and Darla were being swept for physical documentation. Every email, every phone log, every flagged customer complaint from the past year was being dissected. On the 4th floor of the central tower, a task force reviewed security footage from the previous day. They watched as Avon had been blocked, watched as Carlton had stood over him, watched Lorraine refuse his documents and offer redirection to an inferior branch. They analyzed the moment when Avon was escorted from the building, and they noted the faces of the employees who laughed, the clients who nodded, the managers who stood by and allowed it all to unfold. A report began to take shape. A story with names, dates, actions, omissions, and consequences. And while this unfolded quietly inside the corporate infrastructure, the outside world was catching fire. By mid-morning, headlines began appearing on financial blogs, then social platforms, then mainstream media. One read, $2 billion equity freeze after banking executive faces racial profiling in his own investment network. Another followed, private banking giant under fire. Chair of holding company expels entire branch for discrimination. Local news crews showed up first, hovering near the barricades and filming the suits entering the building with file boxes and laptops. But then came the national anchors, the commentators, the opinion writers. The footage of Avon being blocked at the door had been leaked, brief but damning. A lone image of him standing before security, folder in hand, dignity intact while surrounded by institutional condescension, became the visual centerpiece of every headline. Meanwhile, the bank's PR division scrambled to prepare a statement, but the executive leadership had already spoken. The branch would remain closed until further notice. Full audits were being conducted across all private wealth divisions. Employees named in the Memphis file were being called one by one, interviewed under oath, placed on administrative leave, or released outright, depending on their involvement. Lorraine's suspension was extended to include all locations where she had previously held oversight. Blaine's credentials were revoked indefinitely, and a formal complaint about his conduct was filed with the National Banking Board. Carlton, having been subcontracted, was dropped from his firm's active roster and issued a recommendation for racial sensitivity retraining before being allowed back into any corporate contract. Clients began pulling away. High net worth individuals who had once shaken hands in the bank's glass conference rooms began canceling meetings. If this can happen to someone like him, one client said, what does it say about the rest of us? Across social platforms, financial watchdogs and equity advocates began dissecting the larger implications. Was this an isolated branch or evidence of a broader cultural rot inside one of the country's largest financial families? Politicians began weighing in. Public statements were issued. And then came the market response. Barrow and Creed Holdings did not lose value. On the contrary, their decision to respond swiftly and transparently was praised. In the weeks that followed the suspension and public reckoning of Loxley First National Bank's Memphis Central Branch, the silence that had once cloaked the wrongdoing gave way to something more rare and far more unsettling for those involved: reflection. Not every story of accountability ends in defiance or denial. Sometimes, beneath the surface of pride and protectionism, there emerges the uncomfortable seed of realization. For Lorraine Ashcroft, the fall from authority was not immediate in emotion, but gradual, like thawing frost revealing the decay underneath. She spent the first days of her suspension in silence, consumed by disbelief, blaming the system, the backlash, the timing. But that silence, uninterrupted by meetings or staff or affirmations of control, eventually forced her to sit with the memory of that afternoon, not the chaos or the consequences, but the expression on Avon's face when she dismissed his documentation with polite contempt. She remembered how certain she had been that she was justified, how completely she had internalized the idea that power came with the right to decide who deserved service. And when she opened the internal ethics report sent by corporate, read her own name under the section labeled Instances of Institutional Dismissal, something inside her shifted. It wasn't rage or shame. It was recognition. She wrote the apology not because she was instructed to, but because she could no longer avoid the truth of what she had participated in. It began as a personal statement, but she turned it into an open letter. To Mr. Avon Rourke, it began. And to every client I failed to see beyond my own conditioned lens, I offer no excuses. I offer awareness. What I thought was professionalism was often fear disguised as protocol. And I see now that fear becomes cruelty when it hides behind structure. The letter was submitted to the internal board, then released as part of the transparency initiative approved by Avon himself. In it, Lorraine requested to be removed permanently from branch management and instead asked to participate in the company's DI initiatives as a trainee, not a leader. She signed the letter with her full name, no title, and ended it with a question not directed to Avon, but to herself. If we don't know we've been blind, how can we ever see? Across town, Carlton Price was having a different kind of awakening. The security firm that had contracted him quietly dropped his name from active duty, and for the first time in years, he found himself without a badge or uniform to retreat behind. At first, he laughed off the scandal, called it overblown, claimed he had only followed orders. But the viral clip of him blocking Avon's path had circulated far wider than he expected, and the phone calls from old friends became less frequent. What changed him wasn't punishment, it was invisibility. Without the structure that gave him license to control others, he was just a man whose silence had enabled harm. It was during one of his long walks near the edge of the city that he passed a youth center with a mural that read, "Justice is not a destination, it's a direction." He paused longer than expected, watched the kids playing outside. Some of whom looked like Avon had looked that day, confident, composed, unaware of how quickly that could be taken from them. He went inside and asked if they needed volunteers. They said yes. At first, he helped with cleanup, then security during events. But over time, he began speaking to the kids directly, sharing not stories of his authority, but of his failure. "I used to think following rules made me good," he told a group one afternoon. "But sometimes, the rules are built to hide the harm, not prevent it." The center director saw something genuine in him. Carlton stayed. He no longer wore a uniform. He didn't need to. Darla, the junior banker whose skepticism had dressed itself as professionalism, took longer to come to terms with her actions. When she was summoned for review, she denied intent. She said it wasn't personal. She cited policy, bandwidth, scheduling pressure. But none of that erased the footage. None of it made the way she flipped through Avon's documents less dismissive, or the smirk she wore less arrogant. What changed her was unexpected. It came during a mediation session held by the company's restorative justice team. One of the facilitators asked her to sit in the chair Avon had sat in. Then they played the footage, not for punishment, but for perspective. She watched herself from the outside, watched her expressions, her posture, her micro-reactions. She couldn't look away. She didn't speak for several minutes afterward. Then she said, "I thought I was being efficient, but I looked bored. I looked disgusted." The room was quiet. She didn't return to banking. Instead, she accepted a mentorship role in the same restorative justice initiative, helping new hires understand how unconscious bias can manifest not just in words, but in body language, in tone, in the pauses between answers. She wasn't trying to undo what she'd done. She was trying to ensure no one else repeated it. Blaine never spoke publicly. He resigned quietly, moved out of state. Whether his silence was self-protection or reflection, no one knew. But his access was gone, his file closed. And yet, Avon asked the board not to blacklist him indefinitely. "Let silence be a sentence," Avon said, "not erasure." The Memphis Central branch remained closed for 2 more months before reopening under a new name, new leadership, and new policies rooted not in image, but in ethics. When Avon visited, unannounced, he was met with open doors and open hands. He said little, just walked the floors, just looked into the eyes of the staff. And what he saw this time wasn't fear or dismissal. It was awareness, real, earned awareness. As he left the building, someone asked him what justice looked like. He paused before answering. "Justice isn't about retribution," he said. "It's about creating a world where this kind of retribution isn't needed." Then he turned, stepped into the sunlight, and walked forward, calm, tall, unbothered. He had never needed their permission to belong. Now they understood why. The end. If this story moved you or made you think, consider subscribing for more narratives that dig deep into justice, power, and redemption. Let us know in the comments, what part of the story hit you the hardest? Which moment changed your view of the characters? And tell us, Where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to hear your thoughts.